to States of Splendor's podcast number 3. Today's subject is a little bit of a metaphysical one, although it's definitely rooted in reality, in very concrete reality. So the subject of today's podcast is harnessing the power of time. So we'll basically see today that there are many examples of splendor that can be found in places, or that can be found in objects, or can be found in certain professions, certain crafts, that actually have become ingrained with splendor because specifically of their passage through time and forces of time, the molding and sculpting forces of time and the elements. As time moves on, to have one same reality that still stays the same through a long length of time is actually very rare. And this is why you see collector's items and certain items becoming magnificent with time and other items becoming completely discarded with time. So it's a very interesting subject, and it's a very good initiation into the world of splendor. I hope you'll enjoy it. So sit back, relax, and let's get this podcast started. And enjoy. Bye-bye. Today's subject takes us not to a specific place. It doesn't actually take us to a specific time either, for the very subject of today is related to time itself. Harnessing the power of time. Time is often thought as the force that makes us become, to paraphrase the Beatles' Revolution number 9, a little bit older and a little bit slower. It's often seen as the abode of the evil Kronos and the force of decay and death. This podcast entertains the notion that everything depends on the perspective and stance of the observer. Time can actually be tapped into. Time isn't as such a force, but just as distance isn't a force, once running along its pathways, one can harness the potential power that links it to the place in which it exists. As a child, I remember one of the joys I would find would come from a kind of odd hobby. I remember that when I first learned about ice and ice cubes and how ice was made, the freezing process. When I learned about this, I became quite enthralled by the process, and I was mesmerized by the process of making ice cubes in the freezer and fruit juice popsicles. And in the Quebec summer, although Quebec isn't a particularly warm place, in the summer we do have really, really hot days of like sweltering 35-degree days. And that's why I would enjoy coming up with some seemingly out-of-place ice in those summer days with my friend Ravi. I got into making big blocks of ice, actually. And before going to bed, I would fill up large Tupperwares and put them in the freezer. And then, in my bed, I would relish at the fact that while I was sleeping, the water was inevitably turning into ice. So the next day, I would wake up with glee to find a big block of ice. And then I would go with my friend Ravi, and we would smash it on the sidewalk. What I would rest my thoughts upon on those nights when I would have a block of water freezing overnight in the freezer was the satisfaction of knowing that time was on my side and in fact working for me, quietly making for me blocks of ice. This in fact is the basis upon which rests a sizable proportion of the great works of mankind. One of the best ways to illustrate this phenomena is through one of the most emblematic products that humanity has ever produced, this being wine. Wine is a product that has been produced and probably was first produced in the Persian region, and ever since has always been on the way to perfection. although it will probably never be perfected, one of the factors that was discovered that can perfect wine is definitely the work of time. So time works on wine in a special way. It's difficult to analyze all of the processes that are involved, but in a nutshell, what happens is that a wine will become perfected with time. Often you have acidity in certain wines, and you have a certain acrid taste, aftertaste. And so with time, certain wines, not all, certain wines will have the acidity go down with time, and the acridness of the aftertaste will be as if it was filed out with a file. Now, which file is working on this taste? It's the file of time. Wine is obviously a very special product, and not every wine can withstand this test of time. Only certain wines can withstand the test of time. For example, in Canada, very few wines are able to withstand the taste of time. There's wines that are made for the table and wines that are made for the cellar, which are put on the table only after having aged a few years. Now, every wine is obviously not drank in the same year it was made. However, when I'm talking about wines that withstand the test of time, I'm talking about 7, 10 years, even more. So now the goal of the thing is not necessarily to have the oldest wine in the world, because it's not simply the test of time. It's the harmony and the convergence of different factors. You have to have the right wine itself, and for this you have to have the right grapes, the right soil, the right weather. And once the wine is made, you have to age it, but it has to be aged in perfect conditions. It has to be protected, in a nutshell, has to be protected from the light, from the movements of the soil, vibrations, has to be protected from bad odors, because the odors can actually enter the wine bottle and influence the wine itself. And it has also to be in a humid region, because a humid zone, a humid cellar where you age your wine, because if it's not humid, the cork will actually dry up, and when the cork dries up, it lets all of the exterior atmosphere penetrate the wine, and it oxidizes too fast, so it can have a lot of problems. At the same time, the humidity shouldn't be too high, because this can also alter the wine's taste. Now, what we find is certain wines withstand the test of time because they have all the factors that I mentioned also, but the vines will make different grapes, and different aged vines will make different qualities of grapes. To have a wine that can withstand the test of time, you need tannins, and tannins are something that is a relatively bitter compound that will become part of the nature of the wine and actually be an indicator and at the base of its quality. So young vines do not produce grapes that have a lot of tannins. As the vines grow older, they start producing tannins, and the wines that are made from these grapes slowly become more and more able to withstand the test of time. Of course, the wine has to be assembled in a harmonious arrangement of different kinds of grapes. And finally, for wine, to understand exactly how the test of time works on wine, you have to know that, as I said, wine isn't made to be simply aged as long as possible. The test of time on wine is proportionate to a certain curve, which could be called the curve of wine. And this curve is that at the beginning of the bottling of the wine, the quality is not very much there. In the beginning, you can still taste it, but then the wine closes down.
when it closes down, that's where all the work is done, and the enzymatic work in the bottle is doing its job. And over time, after a certain period, it's like if a flower opens, the wine opens up again. And the curve goes up higher and higher and higher, and then there's a peak. And that's the perfect age, the perfect time to open the bottle is when the flower is at its paroxysm. And so once this wine is at the top of its curve, you can open it, and the wine is perfectly ready for the time in which it's opened. And after that, the wine doesn't go bad immediately. The curve slowly goes back down to where it started. So if you wait longer than the perfect time to open the bottle, the quality will slowly but surely go down. So the time work on a wine bottle is corresponding to a curve of quality, and one must, to perfectly use the work of time, open the bottle at the peak of its quality curve. So that is for wine. When the wine is opened after so many years, one can actually appreciate the physical side of the wine, but also the spiritual side of the wine. The physical side of it is the fact that the test of time has actually chemically altered the wine and made it more smooth, as if, as I said earlier, somebody used a file to smooth down the taste curve and make it harmonious. And one can really taste the taste of time. Ones usually become more balanced after all these years. That's the physical side of it, but there's also an intellectual or spiritual side to it, which is the notion that this wine was made a few years earlier in another time by somebody else. And this wine is the fruit of the work of previous people that worked on it, so that the person who is drinking the wine can appreciate it in a further time. Often wine bottles are given as presents. So let's say your grandmother, your grandfather gives you a bottle of wine and you keep it for so many years. When the time is up for the bottle to be opened, when opening the wine, you think, of course, of the wine itself, but also of your grandmother or your grandfather who gave you the wine, the time in which the bottle was actually purchased, and also the time at which the bottle was actually made and all the work that went into it, and what kind of year it was, because every year gives up a different harvest of grapes. So there's all this intellectual side to the wine as well, which makes the test and the work of time doubly more capable of being appreciated by humans. The subject of this podcast is harnessing the power of time. So in here, we're exploring various aspects of this notion, and primarily the one that has to do with food. So since we're talking about different food products that can harness the power of time, we're often referring to a phenomenon that's known as lactofermentation. So lactofermentation is something that we can find in various products. What it is actually, is the fermentation of a product in a way that produces lactic acid in a lactic medium. Only beneficial bacteria can survive. And so that means that the ending product will be fermented, but with only beneficial bacteria. And this means that these beneficial microorganisms can actually enter the gut and contribute to the body's natural immune system. So this is a very interesting notion because it's used worldwide. It's something that the human actually uses, and it has to do with symbiosis. Symbiosis is when there is actually an interaction of animals, but it's not a parasitic relation. There's not one organism that thrives on stealing energy from the other. It's a relationship. It's basically a win-win relationship between organisms and host organisms
when they each offer a way to help the other organism. So in the case of lactofermentation, it's kind of a selection process that makes only beneficial bacteria thrive. We can find this in many aged cheeses. We can find this in sauerkraut, or in, like we saw in the last podcast, kimchi. This is a phenomenon that has made for magnificently delicious products. And there's some that are lesser known. Of course, everybody's heard about kimchi and sauerkraut and cheese, but there are some more exotic examples of this. So if you go in this mysterious volcanic island known as Iceland, you will find a product that I would not dare to pronounce correctly. I'd like to pronounce it correctly, but unfortunately I have no knowledge of that language. But it's spelled Hakarl, Hakarl. It's pronounced very differently, and I profoundly apologize to all the Icelanders who may be listening. So what this is actually fermented fish, but not just any fish. As you probably have known, the Iceland people are descended from Vikings, and these Vikings obviously lived upon the sea's products and thrived upon this. And so one of the rare fish that you can find in Iceland, well, actually, no, that's not true. There's an abundance of fish, a lot of cod around there. But one fish that was very interesting to Icelanders at the time is a kind of shark. It's the Greenland shark, and this shark is the base material for making hakarl. Now, of course, Greenland shark is toxic. There is some component inside it that is completely toxic and can eventually kill the person who would eat too much of this Greenland shark. So the generations, by trial and error, found out a process in which this shark meat can be put under some rocks for a few months, and the fermentation process will actually kill out this poisonous compound and make it very edible. Well, edible is obviously a relative concept, because if a Westerner, obviously Iceland is in the West, globally speaking, but if, say, an American would go to Iceland and try to taste this hakarl, they would definitely have a hard time, because even though I haven't tried it, I can very much imagine what it is. Having had an extensive experience with cheeses, hakarl is beyond cheese, beyond the hardest, most fermented cheeses of this world. It's just beyond it. When a cheese goes bad, it starts to smell like ammonia, and ammonia is definitely the first smell you get off from this fermented Greenland shark. So people will eat this as finger food in bars, and apparently the smell is horrendous. It can remind some people of decaying meat, but once it's in the mouth, apparently it's very soft and very tasty, a bit like a very pungent cheese. So it must be an interesting thing, but I think it would be a good thing to put some pliers on the nose before trying it for the first time. Because even though many people say they're brave and like to taste different new extreme foods, hakarl is apparently very, very extreme and can cause some problems in people that would like to try it. Now, if you go to another country that's very near Iceland, well, it's not very near, but it's actually near population-wise. It's actually quite close, because it's Sweden, and Iceland is one of the Scandinavian nations, and Sweden is obviously the main Scandinavian nation. So Sweden love fish. It's as simple as that. You cannot emphasize this too much. And herring
is an emblematic fish for many countries, not only Sweden. And of course, the Swedes have made a fermented version of this, in which they take the herring and they ferment it for many months. And usually it's put in a tin can who's under pressure, and the product smells so much that you actually have to eat it outside usually. Or else people will sometimes open it under a bucket of water, in a bucket of water, immersed in water, because it really does smell. And it's not just like, oh, that smells quite strong. No, it's a it's very it has caused many fights between people. Some tenants have been evicted because of spreading the brine of this fermented fish. Unfortunately, I will not once again try to pronounce the product. Well, I will, but I apologize for my pronunciation because my Swedish is not very perfected. So it's called SURSTRO with a trema MMING, surströmming. So this fish is world-renowned and is definitely an emblematic food for the Swedes. There's another version of this. Now we're talking about Scandinavian nations. In the same vein, as you know, some Vikings went and colonized Greenland. And Greenland used to be part of Denmark, which is another Scandinavian nation. Today is quite almost independent. So the Inuit from this wonderful country also have their own version of fermented product, which they keep for some time. And while they wait, the time quietly does its job.
The Inuit in Greenland have been hunting the harp seal for hundreds and hundreds of years. And this harp seal is also known as the Greenland seal. So there is also a small bird that kind of looks like a penguin. And this bird is known as the little auk. The Inuit of Greenland have a little delicacy that they like to eat around wintertime, mainly at birthdays or weddings or other special occasions. This delicacy is known as kiviak, Kiviak, kiviak. So the way this delicacy is prepared, it's quite amazing. They start by taking the carcass of the harp seal, the Greenland seal, and they empty it of its contents. And then they take little auks and they put them inside the emptied seal. So they put the whole bird with the feathers and the beak and all. And they put the whole bird inside, and they can put like many birds because these are not as big as penguins. So they put a few of these small birds inside, and what happens is that they can fit sometimes up to 500 of these birds. And then they close the seal carcass and they try to put some fat to kind of get rid of the air inside so that there's no oxidation. And then they put this tightly closed seal carcass with the little ox inside under rocks to put some pressure on it to keep the air out. And then they put a big heavy rock on top to really seal the whole thing. And then they forget it for about 3 months. And in 3 months, like a sail catching the wind, the preparation catches the power of time. And the power of time does its work. And the magic operates, and voila, you have kiviak after 3 months. And the Inuit really relish in the knowledge that they're going to be able to eat this delicacy for special occasions. So this is quite an extreme food for the Western European perception. But however, if I was over there, I definitely probably would try it. It would probably scare me at first. However, I'm sure that there's something to it.
what happens during the time that these little ox are inside the seal carcass is a process of lactofermentation indeed, and the meat is very tenderized, and there's certain enzymatic work that's done, and what results is this unique delicacy that's only known to the Greenland Inuit. It's something to be tried one day, perhaps, if ever you stop by Greenland.
If you go to Egypt and in Sudan, actually, you will find another fish that is gray mullet. And this fish is placed in a salt mix, and it's dried, and after it's fermented for a certain period of time, and it's served, it's called Fesik, Fesikh, and this fish is also presented in special occasions, and it's been a tradition since very, very ancient times. So all these fermented foods are quite special. You can also go to China, and in China you'll find preparation that's called pidan. These are what we know in the West as century eggs. And they've been seen on shows such as Fear Factor. Are you able to eat this kind of egg? And actually what it is a duck egg. And this duck egg is put into a certain clay preparation and is immersed in a liquid mixture. And it's aged. And it's aged for quite a few months. And after that, what happens is the egg yolk, it's comparable to the texture of a cooked egg, but what happens is it cooks chemically in such a way that the yolk becomes transparent and a little bit black, and the egg white actually becomes a little bit transparent, and the egg yolk becomes black, and it's quite an impressive smell. But once it's tasted with another fermented product, which is vinegar, another Chinese specialty, it is actually delicious, and it can really be considered as another delicacy that comes forth from the fruits of the work of the harnessing of time. Now, of course, we could go on because there's an endless worldwide list of food products that are aged and upon which humans wait for fruit to be born. And often these foods are considered very, very special foods, and they're eaten in special occasions, or they're very much appreciated and adopted by the populations which invented these. This is in the food world, but is this phenomenon of harnessing the power of time can be found in non-edible situations as well. So if you take, for example, there exists certain incenses which, when they're aged, actually have a certain chemical work that's done in them that kind of refines the odors and the composition of the resins that are in the incense. And after a year, they become actually, the smell of the incense is greatly altered. And so this can be considered one of the products that count upon the work of time. There exists a legend which stipulates that Stradivarius, the maker of the world's most legendary violins, actually harnessed himself the power of time by burying his violins in the clay of a specific lake which was near the place of his work. This, of course, has not been substantiated, but some say this was the secret of the resonance of his special violins. Now, this is not provable. However, there does exist an analogous phenomenon. This is found in the world of pianos. The world of pianos is a very interesting one because there is a great, long, and magnificent tradition in the making of pianos, which all use different varieties of wood. Of course, everybody knows Steinway and Busendorfer. They're some of the best pianos in the world. They're very well renowned for the work that they do on the piano chords. And one of the decisive things, the components that comes into the making of a piano is definitely the wood. And so there is a certain type of wood that is considered the best. First of all, there's the traditional kind of using the wood that's still standing, and people would go and knock on the wood to hear what the resonance of the wood is, to see if the wood is fit for making pianos. But the Nec Plus Ultra is actually made from people who go diving in bogs for the best wood. What happens is bogs have a very acidic pH, and so in bogs which are actually bodies of water that have no flows in or out. So these bodies of water become covered with some moss, and the water inside becomes kind of stagnant. And it's a specific kind of ecosystem that you can find in northern regions. And what happens is sometimes there's some wood that falls into these bogs. Actually, some bogs are made by the works of beavers. And the beavers will actually, for example, they will stop the water coming out of a lake, so the level of the lake will go up and will inundate part of the land. And some part of this land has trees, and the trees eventually fall into the water of the bog. And this water will actually conserve the wood in such a way that after years and years and years and years and years of being preserved in this bog water, they actually develop apparently amazing acoustic properties. And so some people actually go in bogs to hunt for this very, very, very old wood. We've actually unearthed some almost intact Viking mummies. Well, not mummies, they were just Vikings that fell into a bog, and their bodies have been perfectly preserved. So some people have noticed that some of the wood that is preserved in bogs for a long period of time develop a certain composition that makes for a fantastic piano soundboard. And apparently the resonance of this wood is the best that can be found on the earth. So that's another example of harnessing the power of time. So now here we're talking about different products. But if you take a step back, you can actually realize that this phenomenon is accessible to all of us. It's quite impressive, and it's something that many people are looking for, because actually what happens is, this is a cliche, but in today's fast-paced society, in the 21st century, as we can notice, people are always running around and never take the time. Well, you have it. They never take the time. So time has become kind of a luxury product, if you will. Well, when you mix products and time, often you can have a luxury product. Of course, if the right intention and work is put into it. So what happens is people are kind of realizing that there's a very high demand and a very small offer of time. Time is restricted. Nobody here gets out alive. And all of our time is limited. All of our time on this earth is limited, and thus more and more, in fact, time is a luxury. This is the reason for which vintage products are very, very popular, and more popular actually these days. It is not simply a passing trend. It's something that you can find culturally under various aspects. So first of all, you have the vintage thrift stores which sell products, and some of them are just cheap products. Some of the products, when they pass through time, become like garbage, and some products, when they pass through the power of time, actually acquire something more and become even more beautiful. Sometimes it's for their material appearance, and sometimes it's just for the symbolism or the importance of having an object coming from that time. So you have the first aspect is in this vintage fad, which is actually not a fad because more and more people are going into it and realizing the power of having vintage objects and the interest that can go into it. But there's also the world of antiques. And now antiques, this is like vintage, but to a higher level. Now, antiques, now you're talking about 100-year-old objects, 200 years old objects, and even sometimes more. So this is what makes the difference between excellence and non-excellence. Products which have no interest in them are not a good base upon which to go through the power of time. Same thing for wines. Cheap wines won't age well. They'll turn into vinegar. But a fantastically good wine done with the perfect vines and the perfect terroir will make a wine that will pass through time marvelously. Well, it's the same thing for objects. Objects which have a certain significance will often be embellished by the power of the work of time. And so we can find all this through objects, but also through a cultural idea of the power of time. Retro becomes the culture passed through the harnessing of the power of time. So this retro notion of culture actually starts to seize upon the value of time. And this is something that's very interesting because, as we know with popular culture, often culture lasts less long than before. It's a process through which culture is more and more disposable. If you look at a top 10 or a bestseller list, well, these are often fads that go away in a few months only. And music is considered old only after 2 years, or not even. So that's considered an old song. Oh yeah, no, that's for 3 years ago, 4 years ago. That's an old tune. Well, when you enter this cultural notion of harnessing the power of time, well, some songs indeed turn into garbage after a few minutes. But some songs have a kind of magnificent structure to it that enables it to go marvelously well through the power of time. And thus they become classics. And so you have the notion of retro, that when it's really an excellent cultural product that passes through the harnessing of the power of time, it becomes not something retro, but classic. And a classic is the consecration of the accomplishment of the work of time. It becomes beyond time, an intemporal work of culture. And that's only the highest of excellent cultural products that can attain that level. But it's fascinating to observe the process which coronates certain cultural products or non-cultural products as part of the classics. Now, what makes the excellence of classics is very difficult to know. And that's what the beauty of it is. It's only time can tell. So many songs have been written about this. Time will tell. And this is very difficult to put a finger on what aspect actually changes. And that's what's so marvelous about the splendor that we explore. Here, if you take it back to the world of antiques, there is something that you can put your finger on, because now we're talking about physical products. So if you take, for example, a very old chair of a certain era, a Chippendale chair, for example, or Louis XIV chair, well, this chair has definitely passed the test and the process of the work of time and has become a classic all by itself. But there is something that one can observe and that is very, very popular with designers, mainly interior designers, is with time what happens is there's what's known as patina. Patina is a word that refers to when you have this chair that passes through ages or years, generations, there's patina that develops on it. And that is kind of the glossy, the glitz of these antiques. It's kind of an anti-glitz, actually. It's an it's not something that's shiny necessarily. It's actually nicks and cuts and little scratches that will develop over time. What happens is the product becomes a little bit less perfect, and you can actually see the work of time on it. This is why we're fascinated by antiques, is because you can actually appreciate the generations through which the people, through which these objects passed through. And if you look at it closely, this is the same reason why people, well, it's not really fashionable nowadays, but it's the same reason why people make holes in their jeans. It's the same reason why people will bleach jeans. It's the same reason why we can see things like acid-washed or rock-washed jeans. Their aim is to create a patina, prematurely created. It's artificial, of course, so it has, and one can see that when it's artificially done, the patina is laughable. It's some products are often done and made to look like something that's old, and that's really laughable. It's some kind of constructions are made to have some pieces of wood and they're made to as if they put makeup on it to look old. Well, that's fake, and that's not the work of the power of time. It's imposture. Well, it can be, if it's a cheaper option, it's obviously understandable. But what's wonderful about patina is it has to be authentic. And when it's authentic, often you have one of the signs of a great classic. So, harnessing the power of time and creating classics. It's such a beautiful process, and this we can detect is the type of product which has splendor in it, which is one of the manifestations of splendor. You can find it in culture, you can find it in objects, and you can find it in very old professions as well. So this is a salute to all people whom career is devoted to harnessing the power of time. And it's also a salute to all the people who know how to appreciate the true patina of objects and cultural products and culture in general that has passed through the power of time. I'm Patrick Asikian. I hope you've appreciated this podcast. Stay tuned for some more, and we'll see you on the next podcast, and we'll be talking about the notion of the sense of place. Have a nice week. Bye-bye.